The painting was intercepted 40 seconds before the planet died. A child had drawn it. Their sun, fat and orange, sitting in a purple sky. Wobbly lines for mountains. A stick figure with too many arms waving at nothing. Underneath, in a script that Talis Vor would never hear spoken aloud, the child had written something. The translation software said it meant, "My favorite day." Talis saved the file. Number 11,407. She placed it in the archive, between a 70-year-old's prayer song and a mathematician's unfinished proof. Then she closed the folder and returned to her station on the observation deck of the Vraxith command carrier, where 1,200 warships were peeling the skin off a world called Myrethis. She watched through the viewport, not because she wanted to, because it was her job. The Vraxith Dominion did not conquer. Conquest implied resistance, and resistance implied something worth fighting. The Vraxith harvested. They arrived in a system, surrounded the target world, stripped its resources, cataloged its species for biological utility, and moved on. They had been doing this for 11,000 years across 7 species united under a single flag. The flag was not a symbol of ideology or pride. It was a logistics marker. It meant this area is being processed. Talis was an archivist. Her role was to record. Every species the Dominion consumed got a file. Biology, language structure, atmospheric preferences, cultural output, if any existed. It was thorough work, professional, the kind of work that looked impressive in a database and meant absolutely nothing to the dead. Below her, the Myrethis homeworld burned in long, patient strips. The orbital bombardment was not dramatic. No streaking fire or cinematic explosions. The ships above simply pulsed, and the surface below simply stopped. Cities went dark in blocks. Oceans boiled at the edges. It looked less like war, and more like someone turning off lights in an empty building. Room by room, floor by floor. On the bridge behind her, officers talked about supply lines. One of them complained about a scheduling delay in the next system. Another asked if anyone had tried the new protein paste from the commissary. "Tastes like engine fluid," he said. Someone laughed. Nobody looked at the viewport. This was the part that had taken Talis the longest to understand. Not the killing, the casualness of it. The way an entire civilization could be swallowed, and the people doing the swallowing would not even pause their lunch conversation. There was no hatred, no ideology of superiority being performed. The Vraxith did not believe they were better than the species they destroyed. They simply did not think about it. A farmer does not hate wheat. The Myrethis were a spacefaring people. They had ships, stations, a small military presence in their local cluster. None of it mattered. Their defense fleet had scrambled 40 minutes after the Vraxith arrived. 40 minutes. In that time, the Dominion's forward screen had already disabled their orbital platforms, jammed their communication relays, and begun the atmospheric processing that would make the surface uninhabitable within 6 hours. 40 minutes was not enough time to save a world. It was barely enough time to understand that saving it was no longer possible. Talis had watched the Myrethis transmissions during those 40 minutes. She always did. It was not part of her job. Her superiors did not know she did it, but she had a private folder, deeply encrypted, stored on a personal drive she kept in a pocket close to her chest. And in that folder, she kept the last things dying civilizations ever said. Some screamed. Some prayed. Some went silent. The Myrethis did something she had never seen before. They broadcast a mathematical proof. In the final 11 minutes of their existence as a species, their greatest minds gathered in a university that was already shaking apart and transmitted an incomplete theorem about the nature of infinity. It was beautiful. Talis did not fully understand it, but she understood enough to know it was beautiful. They knew they were going to die. They knew no one would hear them, and they spent their last breath on a math problem they could not finish. She saved it. Folder 11407, subfile 3. She added no notes. There was nothing to say. Later in her quarters, she did what she always did after a harvest. She sat on her cot in the dark, put in her earpiece, and listened to the final transmission. The proof played as audio, a calm voice reading equations while the ground shook in the background. At the very end, just before the signal cut, someone in the room said something that was not mathematics. The translation software flagged it as untranslatable. Talus suspected it was a name, someone calling for someone who was not there. She listened to it 3 times. Then she put the earpiece away and lay on her back, and stared at the ceiling of recorders, which was gray and smooth, and told her nothing about what kind of person she was becoming. The next morning the ship buzzed with a rumor. 3 Vraxith scout fleets had gone silent near an unremarkable yellow star in the outer arm of the galaxy. Not destroyed, not attacked, just silent. Their ships had returned to port on autopilot. Crews alive, systems intact, every log file blank. As if someone had reached into the ships and gently, carefully removed every record of what they had seen. Officially, the report called it a navigational anomaly. Unofficially, nobody wanted the assignment to go check. Talus heard the rumor from another archivist over breakfast. She nodded and said nothing. But later, alone at her workstation, she pulled up the file on the Yellow Star system. It was old, 3 centuries old. The entry was thin. Species 9712, 3rd planet from the star, bipedal, mammalian, carbon-based, technologically primitive by Dominion standards, though they had achieved early spaceflight and were broadcasting radio signals into deep space. Status: extinct, presumed. The file simply noted that all signals from the system had ceased approximately 300 years ago, and no further investigation was deemed necessary. Talus stared at the file for a long time. 300 years of silence from a species that had been shouting into the void with every frequency they had. She did not know why it unsettled her. The galaxy was full of dead species. She had 11,000 files to prove it. One more blank entry should have meant nothing. But the others had not gone quiet on purpose. The others had been silenced. This species had simply stopped talking. That evening, the Dominion High Command announced the next target system, a routine expansion into the Orion Spur, rich with pre-industrial civilizations, ripe for processing. Standard harvest, standard timeline. The fleet would depart in 2 cycles. Talus looked at the projected course. It passed directly through the territory of the Yellow Star. Nobody else on the bridge reacted. Nobody else on the bridge thought it mattered. Talus closed her workstation. She put her hand over the pocket where she kept her private drive, the one with 11,000 last words on it, and she felt the small, hard shape of it against her chest, like a second heartbeat that only she could hear. Something was sitting in the dark out there, and it had been sitting there for a very long time. Supreme Commander Ozrath Kale had won 600 wars, and he had never once used that word for them. Wars implied opponents. The Vraxith conducted operations, clearances, resource integrations. In 600 campaigns across 4,000 years of personal service, he had never encountered a species that required him to think. He planned because planning was his nature, not because the enemy demanded it. He was the greatest military mind in the Dominion, and the quiet tragedy of his career was that his greatness had never been tested. Until the scout ships came back empty. Not destroyed, not damaged. The 3 scout fleets sent to the Yellow Star system returned to Dominion space with their hulls intact, their crews alive, and every single data file erased. Not corrupted, erased. Cleanly, precisely. As if someone had opened each file, read it, and decided the Vraxith were not yet allowed to know what was out there. The crews remembered nothing. Medical scans showed no tampering, no chemical interference, no signs of memory suppression technology. They simply had no memories of the encounter. One scout commander, a veteran of 90 years, sat in the debriefing room and stared at the wall and said, "I remember jumping to the system. I remember jumping back. The middle is just warm. Warm." Ozrath read that word in the report 7 times. He did not sleep that night. Instead, he pulled every file the Dominion had on species 9712. There was almost nothing. A pre-spaceflight civilization on the 3rd planet of an unremarkable star. They had been broadcasting radio signals for a brief period, less than 2 centuries, and then stopped. The Dominion's automated systems had marked them as self-terminated. Probable causes listed: nuclear conflict, environmental collapse, pandemic. The usual ways small species killed themselves before anyone else had to bother. Old enough to read silence, not as absence, but as shape. And this silence had a shape he did not like. He requested Talus Vor by name. She arrived at his office expecting punishment. Archivists who kept private files did not usually receive summons from supreme commanders for pleasant reasons. But Ozrath did not mention her archive. He sat across from her in a room that was deliberately bare. No rank markers, no trophies, no displays of conquered worlds. And he asked her one question. What does a species do when it knows it is being watched? Talus did not hesitate. It goes quiet. Ozrath looked at her for a long time. She had said the thing that had been crawling around the inside of his skull for 3 days. She had said it in 4 words, with the calm of someone who catalogs extinction for a living and has started to see the patterns. He reassigned her to his personal analysis team that afternoon. Together, they began to build a picture. It was not a flattering one. The first anomaly had been reported 2 years before the scout fleets disappeared. A patrol ship passing through the outer boundary of the Yellow Star's system, not entering it, merely passing near it, had noted that the local space was unusually clean. No debris, no micrometeorites, no radiation trails from passing comets or ancient collisions. Space in that corridor had been swept, maintained. The patrol officer had flagged it as a curiosity and moved on. Ozrath pulled the log. Talus found 6 more like it across different patrol routes, spread over 18 months. A sphere of maintained space, roughly 40 light hours in diameter, centered on the Yellow Star. Someone was keeping the area around their home clean, the way a homeowner might sweep a porch. The second anomaly was worse. Long-range gravitational sensors, the kind the Dominion used to map dark matter, had picked up a signature near the Yellow Star's outer system. It did not match any known stellar body. Not a planet, not a station, not a ship. At least not any ship that obeyed physics the way the Vraxith understood physics. The signature appeared for a single sensor ping, 1/8 of a second, and then vanished. As if whatever it was had noticed the sensor and decided not to be seen. 1/8 of a second. That was the response time. Something that large, reacting that fast, to a passive scan. Ozrath did not share this data with the Quorum. Not yet. He needed more. He needed to understand what 300 years of silence could build. He did the math. Talus checked it. A species that achieved early spaceflight 3 centuries ago. A species that was broadcasting, exploring, reaching outward. Then silence. Total silence. No signals, no ships, no probes, no expansion, for 300 years. If they had not died, if the silence was a choice, then those 300 years were not a gap. They were a workshop. A species with the knowledge base to reach space, choosing to stop reaching outward, and instead reach inward. Deeper, further. Every resource that would have gone to expansion, to politics, to war, to the 1,000 inefficiencies of galactic civilization, all of it, turned inward, focused, for 3 centuries without interruption. What could a species build in 300 years of uninterrupted focus? Ozrath asked. Talus looked at the data on her screen. The clean space, the vanishing gravity signature. The scout fleets returned unharmed, with their memories gently removed like splinters pulled from skin. Anything, she said. They could build anything. The 3rd anomaly arrived while they were still working. A Vraxith dreadnought, the Endless Reach, one of the Dominion's 40 capital ships, had been on patrol near the boundary of the clean space. Its commander, a seasoned officer named Vestalori, sent a fragmented transmission on a channel that should not have existed. Her voice was calm, not distressed, confused. "There is a ship here," she said. "I am looking at it. It is not what I expected a ship to look like. It is as if someone asked the void what it wanted to be, and the void answered." The transmission cut. The Endless Reach was recovered 4 hours later, intact, crew alive. Every officer was sitting calmly at their station, unharmed, with the mild, dazed expression of people who had just woken from a deep and not unpleasant sleep. Every weapon system on the dreadnought had been taken apart. Not destroyed, taken apart. Each component separated and cleaned and laid out in precise rows in the ship's cargo bay, like an instruction manual made of metal and light. And then reassembled, but not in the original configuration. One that Vraxith engineers could not immediately understand, but after 6 hours of analysis, realized was roughly 400 years more advanced than their current technology. Whoever had done this had not damaged the ship. They had improved it, and they had done it while the crew slept peacefully at their posts. Ozrath stood in the cargo bay of the Endless Reach and looked at the redesigned weapon arrays. He ran his hand along a conduit that flowed in a curve his engineers said should not work, but did. He thought about a species that had watched the stars for 300 years and decided the galaxy was not ready for them. He thought about what it meant when the galaxy came to them instead. He requested an emergency audience with the Vraxith Quorum, the 7 species leaders who had held the Dominion together for 11,000 years through the simple fact that nothing had ever challenged them. He stood before them in the great chamber, and he used a word that had not been spoken in that room in 4,000 years. The word, in Vraxith, meant threat. But its older translation, the one from the pre-spacefaring texts that Ozrath had studied as a young officer and dismissed as myth, was slightly different. It meant something that is already stronger than you and has been waiting for you to notice. The Quorum did not believe him. The Quorum sent everything. 12,000 warships, drawn from every corner of Dominion space. Dreadnoughts, carrier groups, siege platforms, fast attack screens. The full weight of a civilization that had spent 11 millennia perfecting the art of ending other civilizations. It was the largest fleet mobilization in recorded history. It filled local space with enough metal and firepower to crack moons. Ozrath commanded from the bridge of the Iron Doctrine, the Dominion's flagship. He had asked for a diplomatic channel. The Quorum had denied it. This was not a negotiation fleet. This was a statement. 12,000 ships to say, whatever is out there, we are still the Vraxith. Talus stood at her station in the analysis bay, 3 decks below the bridge. She had been given no specific orders. She was simply told to be present and to record. She was, as always, the Dominion's memory, the one who watched while others acted. The fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Yellow Star system and immediately began formation protocols. 12,000 ships arranged themselves into the Dominion's standard siege pattern, a sphere closing inward, weapons oriented toward the center, designed to eliminate any target regardless of position or maneuverability. Their target was a single point in space between the 4th and 5th planets. It was empty. For 11 minutes, it was empty. Then the Erebus was there. No flash of arrival, No energy signature of a drive system engaging, no ripple in subspace, no gravitational distortion, no sign that anything had moved from one place to another. One sensor sweep showed empty space. The next sweep, taken 1/8 of a second later, showed a ship. It was black. Not the black of paint or coating or any material the Dominion sensors could identify. It was the black of depth. The kind of black that the eye keeps trying to focus on and cannot, because there is no surface to find. It sat in space, and the light from the yellow star bent around it, as if afraid to touch it. It was not large. By Vraxit standards, it was modest, perhaps twice the size of a heavy cruiser. But it was dense. The gravitational sensors screamed. Whatever that ship was made of, it weighed more than the math said it should. It was a small thing that was somehow also heavy enough to gently bend the orbits of nearby asteroids by simply being present. The Erebus did not hail them. Ozrath opened every communication channel the Dominion possessed. Standard frequencies, emergency bands, diplomatic protocols, ancient contact methods that had not been used in thousands of years. He transmitted greetings in 14 languages. He transmitted mathematical primes. He transmitted silence and waited. Nothing. The Erebus sat in the dark between two gas giants and said nothing at all. Then, on a frequency that did not exist in Vraxith communication systems, a channel that their equipment should not have been able to receive, a sound filled every ship in the fleet simultaneously. A human woman singing. The melody was simple, 4 notes rising, 3 notes falling, a pause, then again. It was not a military signal, it was not a weapon, it was a song, and it was the saddest thing that anyone on any of those 12,000 ships had ever heard. Officers stopped mid-sentence. Gunners took their hands off their controls. A Vraxith lieutenant in the Iron Doctrine's forward battery began to cry without understanding why. Talus, alone in her analysis bay, ran the audio through every pattern-matching system she had. Her blood went cold. The melodic structure, the mathematical skeleton underneath the melody, matched the Myrathis proof, the incomplete theorem about infinity that had been broadcast in the final minutes before that world died. The melody was built on it, and not just it. Talus found 6 more matches, 6 other final transmissions from 6 other harvested species, their mathematical and musical structures woven into the fabric of this one song. Humanity had been listening. For 300 years, while the galaxy thought them dead, they had been sitting in the dark, listening to civilizations die, catching the last words, and they had taken those endings and built them into something that could be carried forward. The song was a funeral hymn for the galaxy, and it was made from the bones of the dead. Ozrath gave the order to fire. 12,000 ships fired at once. Kinetic rounds, plasma lances, gravitational shears, exotic matter warheads, everything the Dominion had developed across 11,000 years of perfecting destruction. The Baron was so dense that the space between the fleet and the Erebus became briefly opaque, a wall of energy and metal moving at fractions of light speed. It lasted 9 minutes. 9 minutes of the most concentrated firepower ever deployed by any civilization in galactic history. When the sensors cleared, the Erebus was exactly where it had been. It had not moved. It had not activated shields or deployed countermeasures or done anything at all. The firepower had reached it and simply stopped. Not reflected, not absorbed, stopped. As if the weapons had arrived at the hull and quietly decided not to continue. Ozrath stared at his tactical display. 12,000 ships, 9 minutes, every weapon they had. It had not been enough. It had not been close to enough. They had thrown everything they had at a single ship, and the single ship had treated it as weather. The Erebus acted. There was no beam, no missile, No visible weapon of any kind. The space around the Vraxith fleet simply began to change. The first ship to be affected was a destroyer on the outer edge of the formation. Its hull began to separate, not explode, separate. Every bolt, every plate, every weld and joint, all of them gently, precisely disengaging from each other, as if the ship were a puzzle being taken apart by patient hands. The crew watched their vessel come undone around them. The crew floated in the void, alive and unharmed, watching the pieces of their ship drift apart like dandelion seeds. Then the next ship, and the next. It moved through the fleet like a wave, ship after ship, silently coming apart. No fire, no pain, no death, just 12,000 warships being reduced to their component pieces with the care of a watchmaker disassembling a clock. The crews were deposited gently into the void, in their life pods, each one alive, each one watching. 11 minutes. The entire process took 11 minutes. The greatest fleet ever assembled by the Dominion, taken apart in the time it would take to eat a meal. On the bridge of the Iron Doctrine, Ozrath stood and watched his flagship dissolve around him. The walls pulled away, the floor separated into panels. His command chair unbolted itself and drifted gently upward. He stood in open space in his emergency suit, and he looked at the Erebus, hanging in the dark, black and silent and patient. And he understood. This was not a battle. It had never been a battle. This was a parent taking a weapon away from a child. On the Erebus, on a bridge that no Vraxith eye had ever seen, a woman named Ilara Moan stood with her hands at her sides and watched the Dominion fleet come apart on the display before her. Her crew was silent around her. 40 people on a ship designed for 40. No cheering, no triumph, no satisfaction. The bridge had the heavy quiet of a hospital room. They were doing a thing that needed to be done, and that none of them wanted to do. Ilara touched the pendant at her throat, a small piece of stone, smooth from 40 years of being held. It came from a world that no longer existed, a colony world, far from Earth, that the Vraxith had harvested when she was 6 years old. She did not remember the name of the world. She was too young when it died. But she remembered the sky, a pale orange, almost pink at the edges, and the way the light came through the window of the room where she had hidden while the ceiling fell in. She did not build this ship for revenge. She built it because no 6-year-old should have to hide while the sky falls. The Erebus broadcast one final message, not the song, not music, words, spoken in flawless Vraxith common tongue, transmitted to every life pod, every surviving receiver, every frequency in the system. 6 words. You are seen. We remember them. Then silence. The Erebus remained where it was. It did not advance. It hung in the dark between 2 gas giants and waited, as it had waited for 300 years, as it would wait for however long was necessary. In her life pod, spinning gently among the remains of 12,000 ships, Talis Vor heard the 6 words, and pressed her hand against the viewport, and felt, for the first time in 40 years of cataloging the dead, that someone else had been keeping count. The Dominion did not fall because of the Erebus. The Dominion fell because of what the Erebus made them see. In the weeks after the fleet was dismantled, the Vraxith Quorum held 7 emergency sessions. The first 6 devolved into blame. Species pointed at species. Old alliances, held together for millennia by the simple glue of shared conquest, cracked along lines so ancient that most Vraxith had forgotten the lines existed. The 7 species that made up the Dominion had never needed to like each other. They had only needed to profit together. And now, for the first time in 11,000 years, the profit had stopped. 2 of the 7 species, the Korath and the Valesi, broke from the quorum within the first week. Not because they feared humanity, because they feared being the last one standing when humanity decided that patience was no longer enough. The Korath ambassador's final statement to the chamber was 4 words: "We will not drown." She left through the north corridor and did not look back. Ozrath watched the fracture from his quarters on a borrowed transport ship. The Iron Doctrine no longer existed. Its pieces drifted somewhere in the outer system of the Yellow Star, along with the pieces of 11,999 other ships. He had been given temporary rank and a small vessel, and told to wait for reassignment. He was not waiting for reassignment. He was thinking. He replayed the 6 words on a loop. "You are seen. We remember them." Not a threat, not a demand, not terms of surrender or a declaration of war. The most powerful ship in the galaxy had used its only words to say, "We were watching while you killed, and we did not forget." Ozrath understood, with the clarity of a man who had spent 4,000 years studying how civilizations broke, that this was more dangerous than any weapon. Weapons destroyed bodies. Witness destroyed the story a civilization told about itself. The Vraxith had spent 11,000 years telling themselves that the species they harvested were resources, raw material, numbers in a ledger. The 6 words said, no, they were people, and someone was keeping their names. The Erebus moved. It did not come toward Vraxith space. It went to the Myrethi system, the dead system, the one Talus had watched burn in the opening act of this story, the one with the child's painting and the mathematician's unfinished proof. The Erebus parked itself in orbit over the husk of the Myrethi's homeworld, and it began to broadcast. Not a weapon, not a message, a data stream. The Myrethi's proof, the theorem about infinity that had been transmitted in the final 11 minutes of their civilization. Except it was no longer incomplete. Humanity had finished it. In 300 years of silence, among all the other things they had been building, someone had sat down with the last thought of a dying species and completed it. The proof was elegant. It described how a thing could be destroyed and still be mathematically present, how removal did not equal absence, how the shape of what was taken persisted in the space it left behind. The Myrethists had known this as they died. They had been trying to say it, and now, 3 centuries later, a species they had never met finished the sentence for them. The broadcast went out on every frequency. Every civilization with a receiver, Vraxith and otherwise, heard it. Most did not understand the mathematics. All of them understood what it meant that someone had bothered. Talus Vor was in a holding cell when the broadcast reached Vraxith space. Her private archive had been discovered during the chaos of the fleet's destruction. A routine data sweep of surviving personnel had flagged her encrypted drive. 11,000 files. 11,000 final transmissions. The last words of every species the Dominion had consumed in her 40 years of service. Saved and organized and annotated in her small, precise handwriting. She was not charged with treason. The Dominion did not have a law against remembering. They had simply never imagined anyone would want to. The tribunal that heard her case was made up of 3 senior officers who had survived the dismantling. They sat across from her in a gray room and asked her why. Talus said, someone should know what they sounded like. The officers looked at each other. One of them opened his mouth, closed it, and looked at the table. Another asked if she had shared the files with anyone. She had not. A third asked what she intended to do with them. Talus said she did not know. She had never planned that far ahead. She had simply been unable to let them disappear. The tribunal released her. Not pardoned. There was no crime to pardon. Released because they did not know what else to do with a woman who had committed the act of paying attention. Within days, it did not matter. Her archive leaked. Nobody determined how. Perhaps a sympathetic officer. Perhaps a system error during the chaos of the Dominion's fracture. But the files spread across Vraxith networks, with the speed of something the population had been hungry for, without knowing it. 11,000 final transmissions. The last songs, prayers, proofs, and silences of 11,000 dead civilizations, suddenly available to every citizen of the Dominion. The child's painting from Myrethus went viral first. A fat orange sun in a purple sky. Wobbly mountains, a stick figure waving. My favorite day. It appeared on screens and walls and public displays across Vraxith's space. People stared at it. They did not know what to do with it. It was not propaganda. It was not a weapon. It was a drawing by a child who had been dead for months. And it sat in the gut like a stone, because it looked exactly like the kind of thing any child anywhere might draw. And that was the point. That was the entire point. Ozrath took his borrowed transport ship and flew to the Erebus alone. No weapons, no escort, no authorization from the Quorum, which had functionally ceased to exist. He flew to the dead Myrethus system, and he approached the black ship in orbit, and he opened a communication channel and said, "I am Ozrath Kale. I commanded the fleet you disassembled. I am alone. I would like to understand." The Erebus let him dock. What he saw inside, he did not describe in full. Not then, not ever. When he returned to Vraxith space 3 days later, he requested an audience with whoever was still willing to listen. A handful of former Quorum members, some military officers, Talus, who attended uninvited and was not asked to leave. Ozrath told them one thing. "They have a room," he said. "It runs the entire length of the ship. The walls are covered in names. Not human names. The names of every individual from every species we have ever harvested. Every name they could reconstruct from the data, from intercepted transmissions, from recovered records, from fragments. Millions of names. They are still adding more." He paused. "They built a memorial. Inside a warship. The most powerful weapon in the galaxy, and its heart is a room full of the dead. That is what they have been doing for 300 years. Not building weapons, building memory. The weapons are just how they protect it." The room was silent. Talus thought about her archive. 11,000 files. She had thought she was alone in keeping count. She had been wrong. On the other side of the galaxy, behind 3 centuries of silence, someone else had been counting, and their count was longer, deeper, and more careful than hers. That night, the Erebus broadcast again. Not to the Vraxith, to everyone. Coordinates, a location in deep space, far from any system, far from any established route. A time, 6 standard weeks from now, and a single word that in every language it was transmitted in meant the same thing. Come. No explanation, no context. Just a place and a time, and an invitation extended to every surviving civilization in the galaxy. The remnants, the refugees, the hidden, the few, from a species that had been silent for 300 years, and was now, for reasons it did not explain, ready to speak. Talus stood at the viewport of the holding facility, where she was still technically detained, and looked out at the stars, and thought about a child's drawing of an orange sun, and a mathematician's proof about how destroyed things persist, and a room full of names on a ship that moved like grief given purpose. She decided she was going to those coordinates. She did not yet know how. But she had spent 40 years cataloging endings, and she was very tired of endings, and this sounded like it might be something else. They came in ships that should not have still been flying. Converted freighters with patched hulls. Mining vessels stripped of their drills and fitted with sleeping quarters. Colony ships that had spent decades drifting in the cold spaces between stars. Their populations surviving on recycled air and rationed hope. One species arrived in a vessel that was technically an asteroid. They had hollowed it out and strapped engines to the back, because it was all they had left after the Vraxith found their homeworld 80 years ago. They came from nebulae where they had hidden, from asteroid belts where they had built quiet lives in the dark, from moons of gas giants where the Vraxith scanners could not reach. They were the remnants, the ones too small, or too hidden, or too stubborn to die when the Dominion said it was their turn. Talis Vor arrived in a stolen shuttle. She had walked out of the holding facility on the second day, after it became clear that no one was staffing the holding facility anymore. The Dominion's administrative structure was collapsing inward like a building with its foundations removed. Officers abandoned posts. Supply chains broke. Entire military installations went quiet, not destroyed, just empty, their crews walking away from jobs that had lost their meaning overnight. Talis found the shuttle in an unguarded hangar, entered the coordinates, and left. She did not look back at the Dominion. There was nothing behind her worth looking at. The coordinates led to a point in deep space, far from any star or system. Empty, according to every map the galaxy had ever drawn. But when Talis's shuttle dropped out of faster-than-light travel, the space was not empty. The structure was the size of a small moon. It was not a station. It was not a habitat. It was shaped like a seed, tapered at both ends, wide in the middle, its surface covered in patterns that shifted slowly, like text being rewritten in real time. It hung in the dark with no star to orbit, generating its own faint light, a pale gold that made the surrounding ships glow, as if they were sitting in a sunrise that had no source. The Erebus was parked beside it, small by comparison, a guard dog next to the thing it had been guarding. Talis docked. A human met her at the airlock. He was unremarkable, medium height, tired eyes. He wore a uniform that had no insignia and no rank markers. He looked at her and said, "You're the archivist." Not a question, he knew. "You have our transmissions," Talis said. "The final broadcasts." "I kept copies." "We know," the man said. "We've been listening to the same ones. But yours have notes in the margins." He paused. "We'd like to compare, if you're willing." Talis followed him inside. The structure's interior was a library. That was the only word for it, though it was not a library of books or data crystals or any storage medium Talis recognized. The walls were alive with information. It moved, shifted, reorganized itself as she walked past. Languages she recognized: Mirethis, Korathin, the musical script of the Vendurai, dead 2,000 years, flowed alongside languages she had never seen, hundreds of them, thousands, each one preserved in its full complexity. Grammar, idiom, slang. The way a language sounded when its speakers were happy, frightened, in love, dying. 300 years, Talis said. She was not asking. She was beginning to understand the scale. The human beside her nodded. 312. We started with the radio signals, the ones we were already receiving before we went quiet. Fragments of civilizations calling out into the void. Most of them were already dead by the time their signals reached us. But the signals were still traveling, still carrying their words, so we caught them. He led her deeper. There were rooms dedicated to science, the mathematical and physical discoveries of harvested civilizations, reconstructed from fragments, extended where possible, preserved where not. The Mirethis proof was displayed on an entire wall, the original incomplete version alongside humanity's completion, the two halves fitting together with the precision of a conversation between two speakers separated by death. There were rooms dedicated to art, visual art, music, architecture, textiles, extrapolated and reconstructed using every scrap of data humanity had been able to recover. A Vendori symphony, rebuilt from radiation echoes, played softly in a chamber designed to replicate the acoustics of their concert halls. The acoustics of concert halls that no longer existed. There were rooms dedicated to biology, DNA sequences, ecological models, complete reconstructions of biospheres that had been burned to ash. Not cloning, no one was being resurrected. But the knowledge of them was preserved. The shape of every leaf, the pattern of every migration, the chemistry of every ocean. Everything the Vraxith had destroyed was present here in its full complexity, held in the careful hands of a species that had decided remembering was worth 3 centuries of silence. You didn't build a weapon, Talus said. No, the man said. The Erebus is just how we kept it safe. Talus stood in a room that contained the complete cultural output of a species called the Falori, who had been harvested before she was born, and she pressed her hands against a wall that displayed a Falori lullaby in notation she could not read, and she did not cry, but her body shook with something that was not quite grief and not quite relief, but lived somewhere between the two. Outside, the remnant ships kept arriving. Species that had never met each other docked at adjacent ports and stared at each other through viewports with the wary, wondering expressions of people who had each believed they were the last ones left. A Korathin freighter captain and a Marethis-descended colony leader stood on opposite sides of an observation deck and looked at each other and said nothing for a long time. Because what do you say to someone who survived the same thing you did, in a different time, in a different place, and is standing here now for the same reason? The humans moved among them quietly. They were not hosts, they were not leaders, they were archivists, engineers, translators. They asked questions, they listened, they recorded, they offered food and medical attention and docking repairs, and when asked, they explained what the structure was. A seed vault, not for grain, for civilizations. Everything the Vraxith had destroyed, preserved. Everything the galaxy had lost, remembered. Not resurrection. No one was pretending the dead could be brought back. But their work, their words, their thoughts, their beauty, all of it held in a place where it could not be burned or harvested or forgotten. A monument made of data and devotion, maintained by a species that had chosen 300 years of solitude over the risk of losing a single additional voice. Ozrath did not come to the gathering. He returned to the Vraxith homeworld. The quorum had dissolved. The Dominion existed in name only, its authority crumbling as species and factions and individual officers walked away from a structure that had held together only because it had never been challenged. Ozrath did not attempt to stop the collapse. He did not rally loyalists or broker new alliances. He went to the Central Archive, the official Vraxith record, and opened the harvest logs. All of them. 11,000 years. Every operation, every system targeted, every species consumed. He made them public. He did not need to. Then he sat at his quarters and played the completed Myrethus proof on his personal audio system. The mathematical description of how destroyed things persist, how absence is not emptiness, how the shape of what is taken remains in the space it leaves behind, and that shape is in its own way immortal. He listened to it until he understood it. Not the mathematics, the grief. On the Erebus, in the memorial hall that ran the length of the ship, Ilara Moan walked alone. The names covered every surface, millions of them. Names reconstructed from scraps of data, from intercepted transmissions, from the fragments that survive when everything else is burned. She had walked this hall 1,000 times. She knew sections of it by heart. She knew which names had been added recently and which had been there since the early years, when humanity first began to understand the scale of what the Vraxith had done. She stopped near the end of the hall. A small section, sparse, a colony world harvested early in the Dominion's expansion, poorly documented. The Vraxith had not even bothered to record it thoroughly. A minor operation, a small population, barely worth the fuel. The entry in humanity's memorial was correspondingly thin. A catalog number, a rough description of the biosphere, an estimated population count, a handful of names pulled from a single intercepted broadcast. Elara touched the wall. Her fingers rested on the catalog number. She had looked at this entry 1,000 times. She would look at it 1,000 more. She reached up and unclasped the pendant from her neck, the small stone, smooth and warm, from 40 years of being held. A piece of ground from a world whose name she did not know, whose sky she remembered as pale orange, fading to pink at the edges, seen through a window that was falling in. Beside the entry, there was a small alcove, shallow, smooth, as if someone had carved it into the wall and then waited. She placed the stone inside. It fit. She pressed her palm flat against the wall, over the alcove, and stood there for a long time, in the quiet of a room built to hold the weight of everything the galaxy had lost, and she did not speak, because there was nothing left to say that the room did not already know. In the seed vault, Talus Vor sat at a terminal and opened a new file. Not a record of the dead, a record of the living, a catalog of the species arriving at the coordinates, the remnants and survivors and hidden ones who had come because a voice in the dark had said come, and they had been lonely enough and brave enough to listen. She began to enter names. Languages, first contact notes, the small details that make a species real, the way they greet strangers, the sounds they make when they are happy, the things they reach for when they are afraid. She labeled the file with the number 1. Outside, in the vast and patient dark, the ships kept coming.